Did you know that Sparxie references Alice in Wonderland, the rise of modern Japan, and the final stand of history's last samurai? Sparxie is our introduction to Planarcadia, a loose cannon who kicks off our journey on the planet with a bang. She's chaos incarnated, a devious, mischievous schemer with a method to her madness, who's the perfect representative of the unhinged side of the planet of elation. She's an enigma who leaves behind more questions than answers in the wake of her mayhem. And one of the main mysteries we're left to contend with by the end of patch 4.0 is who Sparxie really is. What we do know about Sparxie is that her homeworld is an open reference to real-world Japan, which provides clues about what she represents. In this video, I'll be analyzing the elements of Sparxie's character that align with Japan's modern history and culture as the nation emerged on the world stage. Let's first talk about Sparxie's design and how it reflects her personality. Her outfit draws on a specific Japanese fashion trend which emerged in the 1970s onwards, known as the cute style, which, as you might guess, emphasized cuteness as an aesthetic. The style emerged as a form of escapism and self-expression for young women. They dressed as stylishly as possible, becoming an ideal version of themselves that was unbound by the worries of the modern world and daily life. This itself aligns with Sparxie's stream personality already. She repeatedly presents herself to her viewers as an endearing, vibrant girl who's able to excel in any niche her audience wants. In other words, she's made herself a beloved protagonist for her viewers to relate and look up to. In the late 1980s, a specific subgenre of the cute style emerged, which really emphasized an old-time maiden kind of look. A key characteristic was the use of lacy, frilly dresses and skirts that were reminiscent of what you'd see at a Victorian British tea party. It's a kind of fusion of older European aesthetics with Japanese ones that stands out for its captivating extravagance, and its influence on Sparxie's outfit is very clear. She's wearing a kimono that has those laced edges with a frilly ribbon bow as the sash to tie it, and her shoes, hat, and other accessories also showcase the elaborate details typical of the style. Cute fashion was especially popularized from the 1990s onwards by Japanese singers as part of the visual kei movement that emphasized wearing unique and eye-catching costumes on stage. In other words, the outfit was central to the performance. It advertised a surreal doll-like vision of innocent charm that was so popular that the Japanese government even established ambassadors of cuteness. This is exactly the point of Sparxie's own outfit, to complement her performance as a streamer and draw in new fans. In her own words, 70% of being a streamer lies in character design. The cute aesthetic itself comes in many variations. There's gothic, pirate, aristocratic, Chinese style, and countless others. Sparxie draws on one which is heavily inspired by the tale of Alice in Wonderland, written in 1865 in Victorian England by Lewis Carroll. To briefly summarize the story, a young girl, Alice, is lounging about when she suddenly spots a white rabbit wearing a coat with a pocket watch run by. He leads her down a rabbit hole into Wonderland, a place where nothing is like the real world. It's quirky, chaotic, and above all whimsical, making it a perfect source of inspiration for cute fashion. Alice meets a bunch of interesting characters in Wonderland, and Sparxie references many of these figures, starting with the white rabbit himself. The rabbit is a prevalent theme throughout Sparxie's design, featuring on her ribbon, her top hat, and in the boss form of her. It's basically a Sparxie mascot at this point, and Rappa even calls her Ninja White Rabbit. In the story, after our first run-in with her, she also just poofs out of existence, not unlike the Cheshire Cat from the tale that only left behind its grin before disappearing. Her top hat is taken from the Mad Hatter, a nonsense-spewing fellow who's sentenced to an eternal tea time. Next, she has some mushrooms on her clothing and also uses them in combat. In the tale, Alice eats some mushrooms that make her grow and shrink in size. Lastly, the various card symbols as well as Sparxie's red, white, and black colors reference the main antagonist of the tale, the Queen of Hearts and her court of playing cards who dramatically sentence anyone, including Alice, to execution. With all this symbolism, you might be thinking that Sparxie is supposed to represent Alice herself. But the nods to all these inhabitants of Wonderland are actually to showcase that Sparxie symbolizes them instead, the ones who led Alice deeper and deeper into their home. Consider that the entirety of patch 4.0 centers around Sparxie and Sparkle quite literally from the moment we step off the express. Alice is us, the Trailblazer, and Sparxie alongside Sparkle is our introduction to the madness of Planarcadia, a planet ruled by elation, a literal wonderland. This is, after all, her home turf, and if you recall, one of the earliest things we learn about Sparkle is that she tries to embody elation as much as possible, making her the ideal person to really lead us down Planarcadia's rabbit hole. Just like Alice running after the White Rabbit, we spend this first patch chasing after Sparxie across the planet of elation, even ending up at the tavern just to retrace her steps, a literal fool's errand. She poses as an antagonist like the Queen of Hearts, forcing us to go after her, but what this really does is leave us more embroiled in Planarcadia's chaos than ever. Because we end up entering the Phantasmoon games to stop her, we now have something at stake and there's no backing out even after she's defeated. Courtesy of Sparxie, the Trailblazer's adventure in Planarcadia has only just begun without anyone knowing where it will end, ironically reflecting what the Cheshire Cat tells Alice in the tale. When she asks the cat which way to go, it asks her where she wants to go, to which she replies that it doesn't matter as long as it leads her somewhere. The cat tells her not to worry then, because she was bound to reach a destination eventually as long as she kept going. An attitude very much reflective of the Trailblazer as a path, where the journey and pushing forward into the unknown is what matters most. Now, having established that Sparxie's design is Japanese, you might be wondering why she's so visibly different from the original Sparkle, who's also Japanese but in a more traditional style with her red kimono, cherry blossom and koi motifs, kitsune fox mask, and flat zori sandals. This drastic change in style between the two represents the historical stages of Sparxie's home planet, Planarcadia, which in turn parallels the historical transition from feudal Japan to modern Japan. A very brief synopsis of Planarcadia's history is that it's an ancient planet gazed upon by Aha, granting the planet the Phantasmoon. In this early period, it was known as Benzai Tengoku, and was already home to the factions of the Elation like the Masked Fools and the Morning Actors, who took part in the Phantasmoon games. Planarcadia was part of the cosmos, but it was a one-of-a-kind culture given the path that it followed. At some point in time, however, the Destruction's antimatter legions showed up in Planarcadia's star system, and both the planet and its elation risked being destroyed entirely. In the face of this threat, Himiko's ancestor, the legendary painter Graphia, won the Phantasmoon games and locked away the entirety of Planarcadia into a painting, safeguarding it from the legions and hiding it away from the galaxy at large. This isolation to preserve Planarcadia and elation from external forces reflects the history of Japan during the Edo era. Between 1603 and 1868, Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate. The shogunate was essentially a hereditary military dictatorship governed by the shogun from his castle in Edo, hence the Edo era. It was established after 2 centuries of non-stop conflict in Japan, known as the Sengoku or Warring States period, after Tokugawa Ieyasu managed to unite the nation. Like Planarcadia, Japan was split up into countless factions. It was divided into hundreds of domains, and each one was ruled over by a daimyo, essentially a samurai lord, who had to pledge loyalty to the shogun. The Emperor of Japan was a figurehead who did not take part in politics. He lived in Kyoto in seclusion. During most of the Edo era, the shogunate was almost entirely closed off from the rest of the world in a policy known as sakoku, literally meaning locked country. Sakoku was implemented in 1633, after a few decades of open trade with European merchants from mostly Portugal and Spain. These 2 nations were, at the time, expansive Catholic empires, and many of their missionaries from the competing Portuguese, Jesuit, and Spanish Franciscan orders were present in Japan, which, as a result, had a growing Christian population in the 16th and 17th centuries. Several events occurred in these decades that made Japanese authorities grow suspicious of the Catholic merchants. In 1596, a Spanish vessel shipwrecked in Japan, and the pilot of the ship showed Japanese officials a map of Spain's overseas colonies. He insinuated that Catholic missionaries were the vanguards of the empire, who arrived in a new land to set up a base of local support before soldiers arrived to conquer it for Spain. Furthermore, he revealed that Spain and Portugal were currently under the same crown, which went against years of explanations by the Jesuits that the two countries were separate. A year later, the then ruler of Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who Ieyasu succeeded, crucified many Japanese Christians and European missionaries, as he began seeing them as an imminent threat to Japan. As other European traders from England and the Netherlands that were hostile to Spain later arrived in the region, they repeated the same claims of the Spanish pilot to the third Tokugawa shogun, which, alongside the Spanish colonization of the nearby Philippines and a string of rebellions by Christian samurai, convinced him that Japan was in danger. He subsequently implemented the policy of Sakoku by expelling most foreign merchants and preventing any Japanese from leaving the country. Christianity itself was banned in Japan, with local Christians being forced to publicly renounce their faith. Contrasted to Planarcadia, the shogun's actions and motivations mirror Graphia's own, in both cases isolating themselves from the rest of the world to preserve their realms against an existential threat from abroad. As a result, Planarcadia and its elation avoided the destruction's onslaught, whilst Japan and the shogunate avoided imperial conquest. The original Sparkle represents what was safeguarded through isolation in both instances. For one, she's the fool's fool, the self-proclaimed elation who's a big shot at the tavern and is so unhinged that she even gives Sampo pause. She embodies that authentic, unfiltered form of elation that survived thanks to Graphia locking her world away, an elation which directly draws on Edo-era culture. The most notable example of this is Graphia's Wave, her masterpiece, which is based on the famous Edo-era woodblock print, The Great Wave off Kanagawa. Sparkle thus fittingly wears an older, traditional style of Japanese clothing that not only survived, but evolved and even thrived during the Edo era's 2 centuries of isolated peace and stability. A real golden age for the arts in Japan. The next stage of Planarcadia's history is when it exited its isolation and rejoined the galactic community. We're told that, from the very get-go, this was a process involving outside powers, namely the IPC, who helped the survivors of the planet rebuild their home through what they call the Worlds Reborn Initiative. This meant that from here on out, the IPC was involved in Planarcadia's politics, and they're already in control of the planet by the time we arrive. In other words, Planarcadia's reintegration into the broader cosmos was directly tied to a foreign power's interference, which is a striking parallel to the way Japan itself exited isolation. The policy of Sakoku formally came to an end in 1853, when the United States Navy arrived in Japan with several warships. Led by Commodore Perry, the expedition had the explicit goal of ending Japan's isolation and opening it up to American trade. The fleet threatened to bombard and occupy Edo if the shogun did not accept the American demands to open up the country, and without much of a choice, the shogunate accepted the offer. Many European countries like Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands signed similar treaties soon after, with dire consequences for the shogun. These trade agreements were known as the unequal treaties because they gave the Western nations very favorable terms, including the status of extraterritoriality for their residents in Japan. This meant that foreigners from these countries were exempt from Japanese law even if they committed a crime, essentially giving them a free pass to do whatever they wanted within the shogunate. In other words, through the threat of overwhelming military might, the Western powers had successfully forced Japan out of isolation and into the global economy as a captive market, one that had to conduct trade and cultural exchange on the West's terms through the one-sided unequal treaties. Now, you might think that what the shogunate faced was comparatively more aggressive than what the IPC did in Planarcadia. After all we're told is that they helped the natives of the planet rebuild their world with IPC technology and resources. Keep in mind, however, that this is the IPC's own version of the events for a planet that they now rule. This is a faction that we witnessed with our own eyes in Belobog leverage its superior military and technology to force a small, secluded world to accept its terms, something that was only stopped through our direct intervention. That's not to mention that that was the work of the Strategic Investment Department, the branch of the IPC that's actually willing to negotiate, and the one that's only recently come to control Planarcadia sometime in the last 15 years. Other branches like Oswaldo Schneider's Marketing Development Department have shown themselves to be far more ruthless, even willing to bombard worlds to acquire them, and there's no real way of knowing how peaceful Planarcadia's takeover by the IPC actually was. In any case, the IPC's presence in Planarcadia has changed the planet's course forever. The world of Elation is now intertwined with preservation's influence, whether the planet's inhabitants like it or not, against something that finds its roots in Japanese history. The signing of the unequal treaties marked the beginning of the end for the Tokugawa shogunate. After centuries of the emperor staying out of politics, Emperor Koomei openly issued an order to expel the barbarians. This resonated amongst many samurai and their lords, for whom the same fear of being taken over from 2 centuries ago had been reignited as the shogun had now clearly failed to safeguard Japan from the demands of foreign powers. For context, at the same time in the rest of Asia, the Qing dynasty in China, which had traditionally been Japan's main cultural influence, had just lost 2 wars against several Western powers, and much of the rest of Asia was already colonized by this point. There was a real crisis within the shogunate, as samurai began attacking foreign merchants, whilst daimyos secretly bought weapons from them to build up modern armies. This meant that the shogun was forced to deal with both the Western governments demanding compensation and even bombarding Japanese cities, as well as the covert disloyalty and treason of his own subjects. It all came to a head in 1868, when the daimyos of Satsuma domain and Choshu domain allied to confront the shogun. They seized Kyoto, where the 15-year-old Meiji had recently become emperor, and declared that his absolute authority had now been restored. When the shogun responded with military force, it kicked off civil war, in which the emperor's loyalists triumphed, marking the beginning of the Meiji era and really of modern Japan as a whole. Almost immediately, the new government declared a policy of Bunmei Kaika, literally meaning civilization and enlightenment, that aimed to totally reform Japanese society along a Western model. The philosophy of Meiji-era scholars was that Japan had to sit at the table as an equal of the Western nations, otherwise it would end up on the menu. As a result, over the course of the next 5 decades or so and across virtually every field of study, Western thought shaped and influenced the basis of the new Japanese nation. From education curriculums to the armed forces and the new constitution, Meiji Japan drew on the West, both sending its own bureaucrats and administrators to study in Europe and the United States, as well as inviting advisors from these nations to assist the government. It was a gradual but total upheaval of Japanese society that marked the definitive end of the feudal era, and a lot of the things we associate with Japanese culture today are relatively recent innovations from the Meiji period born out of the Western influence on Japan. Take, for example, Japanese curry, which was brought to Japan by British sailors who themselves got it from colonial India. Japanese meat dishes as a whole are all from the Meiji era onwards, as meat consumption was actually banned in Japan before 1872 because of the country's Buddhist vegetarian traditions. Another example is the school uniform aesthetic often associated with Japan, which was actually based on the sailor outfits of the Western naval advisors in the country. Sparxie's Alice in Wonderland references also have their roots in this period. Japan was first exposed to the tale in 1899, during a golden age of relations between Britain and Japan, and Alice instantly became a hit with her Japanese audience. Within 20 years of her arrival in the country, Alice became a popular name for Japanese girls, with over 135 ways to write it in kanji. Ultimately, the Meiji era was a time of sweeping change for Japan, which corresponds to the IPC's own way of governing Planarcadia. For one, they're responsible for renaming it to Planarcadia from Benzai Tengoku. This was an explicit effort by the IPC to change the planet's identity and make it more broadly appealing for the rest of the galaxy, exactly like the Meiji-era vision of establishing Japan's international image as an equal power. Like Japan, Planarcadia also witnessed vast social and political reform under the IPC. First of all, the very fact that a corporation is ruling Planarcadia with a CEO as a planet's governor, rather than a monarch or a politician, is kind of reminiscent of Japan's zaibatsus. These were massive, family-owned business conglomerates that originated in the Meiji era and wielded immense political and economic influence in Japan with ties to the military, political parties, and even the imperial family. After World War II, an attempt was made to dissolve the zaibatsu, but many prominent ones survived, like Mitsubishi, Nakajima, now known as Subaru, and Sumimoto, which owns Mazda. Another example of social overhaul is the fate of the Imaginae, the creatures who exist as a manifestation of wish power. In ancient Planarcadia, they seemed like more aloof, random beings who weren't necessarily part of human society. The IPC's reforms, however, changed the very nature of their existence. They lost their old designation as strangelings, much to Sparkle's dismay, and were mandated to work, obtaining legal status but also being regulated and forcefully integrated into the planet's economy. This actually parallels the way the Meiji government handled segments of feudal Japanese society, like their abolishment of the samurai class or their attempt to emancipate geisha. Other changes include the visible presence of IPC soldiers and technology on the streets, and Pearl's declaration that she outright intends to regulate the Phantom Moon games, something that Sparkle and Sparxie both find loathsome. In this context of non-stop, drastic change for Planarcadia, Sparxie, as an Imaginae native to the planet, is a reflection of the times. Remember her reason for existing in the first place. Sparkle drew her as a live-streaming persona who took life on her own and began to absorb the emotions and desires of her audience. Sparxie fundamentally mirrors what's currently popular in IPC-ruled Planarcadia, what her fans want to see, which is why her fashion is in that more modern Japanese style that blends in Western aesthetics. She even repeatedly calls Sparkle the outdated model, suggesting that her own appearance really is what's most optimal to stand out in Planarcadian society in its current form. Now, this is not to say that Sparxie agrees with the IPC's influence on her home. Like I said, she and Sparkle both openly hate what the corporation is doing, and she is, after all, a criminal in their eyes. Her modern design is more of an end to a means, a necessary part of her strategy to save Elation. Consider what Sparxie's plan actually is during 4.0. She leverages her status as the planet's top streamer in a bid to try and completely sweep through the Phantom Moon games. She's already extremely popular and seeks to take it one step further, with the Sparxicon virus making everyone her fan. If she'd succeeded, this would mean that the entire planet, whether willingly or not, would be fueling her with their feelings, their wish power, and that she would pretty much unanimously obtain Aha's authority and mandate. This would give her the power to sweep away anything that the IPC or anyone else had done in Planarcadia to restore her view of what Elation should be. In the grand scheme of things, Sparxie tapping into the modern IPC-influenced culture of Planarcadia to win the Phantom Moon games is a tiny price to pay for the potential payoff if her plan had succeeded. This need to use the IPC's influence to oppose it, to fight fire with fire, once again parallels Japanese history. If you recall earlier, I said that in the late Edo era, some of the daimyos bought weapons from Western merchants so that they could confront the shogun for his inability to protect Japan from these very same outsiders. In particular, I said that the domains of Satsuma and Choshu led the charge to restore power to the emperor and inaugurate Meiji Japan. In the aftermath of the imperial restoration, however, many senior samurai and Satsuma began to grow worried. They'd supported the emperor with two goals in mind. First was that he'd create a new regime that would be able to stand up to the foreign powers, and secondly was that the samurai would play a central role in this process of national rebirth. Instead, the Meiji government began phasing out the samurai in favor of modern European-style conscript armies, and seized many of their lands and properties as it overhauled the Japanese economy. Furthermore, far from expelling the barbarians as many samurai had hoped, more and more Western influence was increasingly apparent, which greatly displeased many in Satsuma. One such man was Saigo Takamori, who'd been instrumental in leading pro-imperial forces against the shogunate. He was initially included in the Meiji government, but then resigned when his proposal to invade Korea was rejected, returning to Satsuma. As many samurai became ex-samurai and thus jobless, Saigo established private academies which included military training for them in his domain. And he was so popular in Satsuma, it was almost like the domain was under his rule rather than Tokyo's. This was of great concern to the central Meiji government. After all, this kind of regional insubordination is exactly what caused the shogun's downfall just years before, and the government's reforms to eliminate samurai privileges was further stoking tensions. It all came crashing down when students from Saigo's academy raided an imperial arsenal and then convinced Saigo to lead an army against the government, which he ended up doing. The rebel samurai army was stopped in the next prefecture over in Kumamoto. To their great surprise, they were unable to defeat the conscript garrison of Kumamoto Castle and were forced to retreat. In the weeks afterwards, a massive imperial force made its way to Kagoshima, the capital of Satsuma, where against 60-1 odds, Saigo's forces fought to their deaths, the last battle of the samurai in history. In the end, the Satsuma rebellion left behind several legacies. On one hand, it was an extremely ambitious plan which faced disastrous odds from the get-go, yet it was still credible enough of a threat that the Meiji government mustered its full strength to crush it. In the aftermath of the nearly 8 months of conflict, no trace was left behind of the rebel samurai who took their vision of what Japan should have been to their graves. Sparxie's Sparxicon plot is similar in the sense that it was also an absurd, crazy idea from the start, yet the risk of its success, of Sparxie winning the Phantom Moon games, was still dangerous enough that we took the task of defeating her very seriously. Once that's done, however, it's as though it never even happened. Everyone goes back to normal and Sparxie outright disappears, fading away just like Satsuma's samurai as she leaves us with her mask. In both instances, the attempt to tap into modernity to defeat modernity failed, and the rebels' worlds moved on without them. In Japan's case, the samurai class was abolished for good, and the country proceeded full steam with its westernizing reforms in its quest to become a major world power. In less than a century following the Satsuma Rebellion, Japan would go on to defeat the Qing dynasty, found its own colonial empire, end the unequal treaties with the West, emerge victorious in a war against Russia, and then go on the warpath across Asia to project its imperial ambitions. A brutal path of repression and destruction in the occupied territories that ultimately culminated in World War II, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the end of the Japanese Empire. Planarcadia has not reached such a dire outcome yet, but we do know that a huge disaster is predicted for the planet's future, one in which Sparxie's role is unclear. She's no longer a supplicant, and thus her ability to directly affect the Phantom Moon games is weakened, but she still expresses the desire to help us. Even the original Sparkle that we meet hopes that the Trailblazer can intercede in the Phantom Moon games and save them from becoming little more than bargaining chips amongst the big powers of the cosmos. Considering the two Sparkles have now merged back together, Sparxie might share this attitude, which is reminiscent of a traditional Japanese tale regarding the hare or rabbit. The white hare of Inaba is a regional myth in the modern Tottori prefecture. In the tale, a rabbit kami, a being worshipped in the native Japanese Shinto religion, seeks to cross between two islands and decides to trick a clan of Wanizame, literally meaning sea monster or shark, to do so. It dares them to see whose family is bigger, theirs or the rabbit's, and asks the sharks to line up across the water, stating that it will count them one by one. This lets the rabbit cross over on their backs, and it reveals its trickery to the last shark, which angrily tears the rabbit's fur off. This would match up with Sparxie's role as an antagonist, as she tries to deceive us and the entire planet into becoming her fan through the Sparxicon virus. Like the final shark, our answer is rather violent. Afterwards, the rabbit comes across Okuninushi, who later becomes a central Shinto kami, and his 80 brothers who are in the region to ask for the princess of Inaba's hand in marriage. The rabbit requests the party's help. The elder brothers tell it to bathe in salt water and dry itself in the wind, which causes it excruciating pain. Okuninushi, however, advises it to wash in river water and to roll around in cattails. This heals the rabbit, which then reveals itself to be a kami, and gratefully tells Okuninushi that he would marry the princess. This second part of the tale may foreshadow Sparxie as the Trailblazer's ally. Unlike the other factions that have arrived in Planarcadia who scorn the elation and want Aha's power to further their own paths, we're the only ones who reach out with an earnest, helping hand that Sparxie might reciprocate in her home world, even if it only comes after she's tried her shenanigans. Ultimately though, this is just my own speculation. This is the elation after all. The fun lies in not knowing what might happen next. That unpredictable chaos that Sparxie definitely embodied in 4.0 to get the ball rolling on Planarcadia's wild ride. That's all from me. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and comment down below your thoughts. I'm excited to see what's next for Planarcadia, and more Starl content is soon to come. Alright, take it easy and until next time.